Greetings from Dayton, everybody. I'm Amelia.
I'm Tom. This is Monday with Jesus.
Right. And we are delving deeper into the story of Jesus's passion, death, and resurrection according to the Gospel of Mark. So we are up to the trial before Pilate. So Tom will tell us the story, and then we'll have some Q&A commentary afterwards.
So this is the story. Early in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation and developed a plan with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And having bound Jesus, they led him away and handed him over to Pilate. And Pilate questioned him. "Well, are you the king of the Jews?" But Jesus answered and said to him, "You are saying it." The chief priests accused him of many things. So Pilate again questioned him, saying, "Well, have you no answer to make? You can see how many things they're charging you with." But Jesus was silent and said nothing more, so that Pilate wondered. Now at the feast, he used to release to them one prisoner whom they asked. And there was a man in prison whose name was Barabbas, who was bound with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the insurrection. And coming up, the crowd began to demand that he observe the custom. And Pilate answered and said to them, "Well, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he had perceived that it was out of envy and jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests incited the crowd to ask for Barabbas instead of Jesus. So Pilate again asked them, "Well, what then do you want me to do with the one you call King of the Jews?" And they shouted, "Crucify him!" And Pilate said, "What evil has he committed?" And they shouted even more vehemently, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, handed Barabbas over to them. And having flogged Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Now the soldiers led him away into their barracks, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they jammed it on his head. And they spit on him and mocked him and knelt down before him. And they mocked him, doing mock homage. "Hail, King of the Jews!" And when they'd finished mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes back on him. And they led him away to crucify him.
Thank you, Tom. When I teach stories, one of the activities I usually do is have people identify the various story components. And the first one usually is the setting of the story. So we look, the question we ask is are there any time markers with this story, or are there any place markers? And this story begins with a real clear time marker early in the morning. So it's two questions around that. One is, where was Jesus early in the morning when it began? And then secondly, do we have a sense of what time early in the morning meant?
Well, the implication in the story is that it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. The Romans regularly opened for business at 6 o'clock. And it's confirmed by the story. They later, it was at the third hour when they crucified him, which was 9 o'clock in the morning. So this makes sense. It was very early by our standards in relation to when they'd opened for business. And this was that they had been up through the middle of the night with this trial by the chief priests. So after the implication is that after the trial, they had this meeting, and then they bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, like at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Okay. All right, then what's the background of the story? I mean, if we were listening to Mark tell the story back in the late first century, what would we know that, as 21st century Americans, we don't know?
Well, the most important thing is that this story was composed in its present form sometime in the early 70s, in the aftermath of the Jewish-Roman War, which was the greatest catastrophe in the entire history of Israel. When Jerusalem, the temple, were destroyed, 1.5 million to 2 million Jews throughout the empire, but especially in Palestine, were killed and or taken into slavery. So that's in the background of this story. And that's reflected in the immediate background, which is established by Jesus' prophecy. In chapter 10, 33, 34, he says, the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. And they will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will spit upon him and beat him and mock him and kill him. So the implication is then that this is a fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy, and that Pilate is a representative of the Gentiles. So, and in the background is all the conflict and the address of the gospel to Judeans throughout the whole story.
All right. Another thing that I usually, when we do those story components I was talking about, after the setting, we talk about the characters. So we have Jesus, Pilate, and then there's an introduction of another character. He doesn't have a speaking role, but he's significant, and he doesn't have a very long role, Barabbas. But it's a significant role. And another thing I wanted to ask about is you named him, when you told the story, as an insurrectionist, which is not commonly what I think most Bibles, how they interpret the description of who he was. I think they usually, I don't know if they say bandit or thief or something like that. I'm not sure.
Right.
But anyway, talk a little bit about who Barabbas was and why you called him an insurrectionist, and why his presence in the story is significant.
This story, it was composed in the period after the war. And the words that Mark uses in Greek to describe Barabbas, stasis, let me get it just so I can quote it accurately. He was with the stasia stone, those who had committed stases. So these are, stase was murder. And it was also the word for those who had committed murder. And stasia stone is the insurrectionists. And the reason for that translation is that this is the word that Josephus uses more frequently than any other to describe the people, the leaders of the revolution and of the war against the Romans. So the implication is that Barabbas was one of those who was involved in the insurrections against the Romans in Jesus' day, around 33, and that Mark was using that language then to describe Barabbas in terms that were recognizable to those who were living in the aftermath of the war.
Okay.
So Barabbas is then associated with, and the associations of his description so on are of an insurrectionist. And that's the most accurate translation of the words that that Mark uses.
Okay, good. That's good. Now, so it's the chief priest, right? Who? Oh, let me back up. Pilate offers to release Jesus to the crowd, but the chief priests incite the crowd to ask for Barabbas.
Right.
As I heard you tell the story this time, I've never really paid much attention to that word incite, but in the wake of January 6th, 2021, the word incite has new meaning and brought to mind a lot of images of people who have been incited to commit murder, really, make Mike Pence. So that's a powerful word. But why? Well, we understand why people were enraged enough to do what they did January 6th, but in Jesus' day, on this particular day, why was the crowd so worked up, so enraged that they called for Jesus's crucifixion?
Well, the important thing to recognize in relation to the dynamics of this story is that when the crowd comes up, what it raises is the hope that the crowd will ask for Jesus. And the crowd has been, throughout the gospel, the single most consistently positive character. The crowd has chased Jesus around the Sea of Galilee like kids following somebody who's got jelly beans or something. They have rejoiced at him. They have listened to his teaching. He has taught the crowd. He has shown affection for the crowd and fed, 5,000, 4,000. The crowd has been, during his time in Jerusalem, his major source of support. So the chief priests, after Jesus' initial demonstration, wanted to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd. And after his parable of the workers in the vineyard, the chief priest recognized that he was telling this story about them, and they wanted to arrest him, but they didn't because they feared the crowd. So the crowd was Jesus' support and was his primary source of energy and political viability, and was the reason why the chief priests were afraid of him, was that he was so extremely popular. So the expectation is that the crowd would ask for Barabbas or would ask for Jesus. But instead, the chief priests incited the crowd to ask for Barabbas. And the implication is that they incited this in order to recommend the war, revolt against the Romans, and that they were inciting the crowd to ask for Barabbas because they wanted insurrection against the Romans.
Well, that's a different take than you usually hear, isn't it? Yeah. Go ahead.
This story has been, through a lot of the last 2,000 years, has been associated with accusations of that the Jews killed Jesus.
Right.
And the implication here in Mark's story is just about the exact opposite of that. The charge would be that Mark was telling it about them, about the Jews. But this story reflects that Mark is telling it about the crowd, the one with whom we most identify. So it's about us, not them. It's the recognition that we have been involved,
right,
in this fight with Pilate.
Yeah. So what's the impact of this story in relation to contemporary issues of justice and peace?
Well, the implication of this story is that Jesus was a non-violent Messiah, and that when it was time for him as a messianic figure to confront the Romans, he chose a way of nonviolence. And the crowd recognized that and were so incensed by his failure to meet their expectations as the leader of a war against the Romans, that they demanded that he be crucified. So the implication of this story is that Jesus was a non-violent Messiah, and one who did not ascribe to or follow the expectations of a Messiah of Israel in the tradition of David and Saul, of generals who organized armies and attacked the enemies of Rome or the enemies of Israel. Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, he follows a way of nonviolence and of willingness to suffer for the sake of nonviolence, for the sake of the people of Israel, for the sake of the people of the world, to demonstrate a way other than violence. So the implication of this in relation to contemporary issues is that the myth of redemptive violence, the myth that the only way in which the powers of evil can be overcome is through violence, as is the case in virtually all of the video games that get manufactured and sold. This is not about playing war games. This is about Jesus modeling a way of life, a way of being a leader that rejoices in and leads in opposition to violence. And
well, at this point in the story, it looks like his way is not very successful. But we're not done with the story yet. So we'll continue next week.
Yeah.
Yep, to see what happens after the trial before Pilate. So
Okay.
need to sign off.
Okay.
Bye. Everybody have a good week.
All right.